Tonight on All 24 News, a fragile truce hangs by a thread. After 40 days of a war that has upended international law, sent shockwaves through the global energy market, and fractured the Western alliance, the United States and Iran have agreed to a 2-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan. But is this a genuine step toward peace or merely a strategic pause to rearm and recalibrate? As Zionist warplanes continue to pound Lebanon in defiance of the truce, and as Washington demands the total surrender of Iran's nuclear sovereignty, we ask the hard questions. Is the United States waging a war it cannot win for the benefit of a foreign power? And can a global economy already teetering on the brink survive the next miscalculation? These questions and more are put to our panel tonight on All 24 News Special shortly. Good evening and welcome to this special edition, ladies and gentlemen. The developments in the Middle East are moving at a dizzying pace. And before we bring in our esteemed panel of experts, Sahra Farjani takes us through the fragile diplomatic window opening as Iran and the United States hold rare face-to-face talks aimed at turning a temporary truce into a lasting ceasefire. So let's follow the report, then we come back for discussion.
After weeks of fighting, there is now a cautious shift toward diplomacy. For the first time since 1979, Iranian and American delegations are meeting directly, this time in Islamabad under Pakistani mediation. The talks come just days after a fragile ceasefire was reached, ending 6 weeks of war, with both sides now seeking a more permanent halt to hostilities. According to sources close to the negotiations, the first round of discussions has concluded with both delegations exchanging written proposals to confirm areas of agreement. So far, the tone is being described as constructive, but technical talks are still ongoing, and negotiations could stretch into another day. Iran is making its position clear, saying any deal must include a full and comprehensive ceasefire across the region, not just limited to one front.
A ceasefire, a halt to the war on all fronts, including in Lebanon, has been part of the ceasefire deal. This is not only what we have said or claimed. The Pakistani mediator has also explicitly stated this. This has been our demand, and in recent days, the issue has been raised very clearly. Since yesterday, when we arrived here, communication between Islamabad and Beirut have been ongoing. We are in contact with our ambassador in Beirut, who continuously reports to us and to the relevant authorities in Lebanon to ensure that the commitment made regarding the ceasefire are implemented on all fronts.
Officials also stressed their red lines, especially when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, which remains a key point of tension. Tehran says it has already flagged movements that nearly violated the ceasefire, raising those concerns with the Pakistani mediator during the talks. For his part, U.S. President Donald Trump says the United States will make sure the Strait of Hormuz stays open, calling it an international waterway, but admitting it won't be easy.
No, we're not going to let that. It's international water. If they're doing that, nobody knows if they're doing that, but if they're doing that, we're not going to let that happen. Yeah, but that'll open up automatically. The answer is yes, but the strait will open up. If we just left, the strait's going to, otherwise they make no money. So the strait's going to open. It won't be easy. It won't be, I would say this, we will have that open fairly soon.
And while diplomacy is underway, tensions on the ground haven't disappeared. Iranian reports say a U.S. destroyer moved toward the Strait of Hormuz before turning back, after warnings from Tehran that it could be targeted if it kept going. That incident, reportedly shared with negotiators in real time, shows just how fragile the situation still is. So while talks are moving forward, the situation remains tense, and the real test will be whether this fragile ceasefire can actually hold.
And to unpack these complex and fast-moving developments, we have assembled a panel of world-class analysts and academics joining us tonight from 3 continents. From the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, we are joined by Dr. Hussein Fatni, Professor of Law and Society. Professor Fatni apparently will join us just a few minutes later. Meanwhile, from London, we welcome Dr. Anas Tekriti, founder and CEO of the Cordoba Foundation and a renowned political analyst. Dr. Tekriti, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure is all ours. Also from London is Dr. Irfan Raja, a distinguished political analyst and media specialist. Dr. Raja, thank you for being with us again.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And finally, from Genoa, Italy, we have Mr. Mark William Lowe, a geopolitical analyst and corporate risk management expert. Mr. Lowe, good to have you with us again.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you indeed. And of course, let's just get started. And perhaps I start with you, Dr. Tekriti. We have a 12-day ceasefire brokered by Pakistan. Yet within just hours of the announcement, the Zionist entity launched its largest single-day attack on Lebanon, killing over 300 people and injuring more than 1,100, while explicitly stating that Lebanon is not covered by the ceasefire. Now, Iran's parliament speaker has declared that 3 clauses of Iran's 10-point proposal were openly and clearly violated. Now, does this ceasefire even exist in a functional sense, or is this a diplomatic smokescreen, let's say, allowing Washington and Tel Aviv to consolidate military gains while bypassing international law?
I mean, this has been one of the most baffling episodes in modern times, to be perfectly honest, and not necessarily because of what's happening on the ground, albeit quite significant, but mostly because of what's happening in the public view, in the public gallery of media and the like. The fact of the matter is that we don't know, the world doesn't really know, cannot say for certain exactly where we are, whether we have a truce, whether we don't, whether we have the basis for negotiation between Iran and the United States, or whether we don't. If we do, what is the basis of that negotiation? The Iranians are talking of a 10-point plan. The Americans are talking about their 15-point terms, and the two can't be more desperate and more distant from each other. So exactly what is being negotiated, and who stands to gain, as well as obviously who stands to lose from those negotiations. We are now approaching the 40th day of hostilities, and yet the promises from the first hours given by the President of the United States that the regime has collapsed, that the head of the regime has been decapitated, that Iran's defense missiles have been obliterated, that claim that came in the first hours of the attack and were repeated time and time and time again, yet still we're seeing that the Iranians are not only defending themselves, but are also on the attack, particularly with missiles falling on American bases throughout the GCC countries, as well as in Tel Aviv. And of course, they are in control of the most strategic bottleneck in the entire region, that is the Strait of Hormuz, which all of a sudden has become the strategic objective of the United States of America, to open the Strait of Hormuz, which in itself is ridiculous, because the Strait of Hormuz was always open. It was never closed. It only closed because the Americans decided to go and to launch this war on Iran. So anyway, the fact of the matter is that we know is that the Americans and the Iranians are in Pakistan. That we know. However, we have absolutely no idea what it is exactly that they're negotiating. And I just heard the BBC just about 20 minutes ago saying that J.D. Vance's vehicle has been at the negotiation HQ for the past 8 hours, and it's still there, which means that there are negotiations afoot. But exactly on what terms is something that is yet to be clarified. Lebanon obviously is a very, very big point. Iran has made it clear that in its terms, which it claims that the Americans approved of, that Lebanon is very clearly and unequivocally mentioned. Yet the Americans state the opposite, that Lebanon wasn't mentioned. And something like this, you'd assume, is fairly easy either to prove or disapprove. Yet because of the muddied waters that we're operating within, because of the lack of clarity of every single step being taken, because of the fact of who it is that we're hearing and when, it seems that even this quite simple point that could be either proved or disproved is up in the air. But let's make absolutely clear that the attack on Lebanon is a crime. It's a war crime. It's a crime that just is an extension of Israel's crimes that have been committed over the past 2.5 years. And in fact, it's an extension to the crimes that Israel has always been committing with absolute impunity. And therefore, Lebanon, I believe, must be part of whatever negotiations are taking place and whatever resolution or outcome of these negotiations.
Thank you indeed, Dr. Takriti. And now let me bring Mr. Marklow. Mr. Marklow, from a geopolitical and risk management perspective, this ceasefire is fractured between multiple versions of reality. So Trump insists on a real agreement that demands the closure of Iran's nuclear file and open shipping lanes, while Iran's version calls for U.S. troop withdrawal from the region and also retains sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. When you look at the divergence between these two positions, which are two maximalist demands, what is the actual probability of these Islamabad talks yielding anything more than a temporary lull, let's say, before a much larger regional war?
That's a very complex question, Karim, and it's a very good question. So let's try and break it down. Let me start by saying that, in my opinion, what is actually happening, and very interesting for the BBC to report that Vance's motorcade is still in the compound sector, which is a good sign. But let me start by perhaps being a little bit, not radical, but a little bit different. I don't consider what's going on as negotiations. I think this is basically an emergency summit. An emergency summit convened by Pakistan that is doing it for altruistic as well as egoistical reasons. Pakistan recognizes that any escalation would be absolutely disastrous to its economy, and therefore to its stability, and therefore to its political future. Anyhow, let me move on. So for me, it's an emergency summit. It's a case of testing the proverbial waters. We've got the two sides, Iran and the United States of America, who are talking, hopefully in the same room, hopefully not in two different rooms. We can't rule anything out. We don't have enough information for the time being. But the probability of anything concrete, anything particularly articulated coming out of this, I would say, is very, very low. The probability of this leading to a continuation of this pause in hostilities, hopefully, is very, very high. But I repeat, I think what's happening right just now is that the two parts are testing the proverbial waters, as it were. Nothing more than this. And the bad news for President Trump is that he's going to be very, very disappointed, because we also have to factor into the overall consideration another actor. But this time, it's not a state. It's not Lebanon. It's not Israel. It's not Iran. It's not the United States of America. It's the President of the United States of America, who is desperate for some sort of solution, something that's going to help him, because he desperately needs help at this moment in time, where the price at the petrol pumps is starting to hit the Americans, and they are starting to wonder what is actually going on. So Trump will hold high hopes for all of this. And I think for the first time in my life, I actually feel quite sorry for the Vice President Vance, who is going to have to go back to Washington with something. Otherwise, he ultimately will be the man that failed. And it's always good to have somebody to give the blame to. All of this in the context of the next American elections, they're very much being the Vance versus Rubio contest. So Vance desperately needs something positive to come out of this. Anyway, that said, it's not a negotiation built on shared ground at all. It's a confrontation, as you say, between two sets of maximalist demands. Apart from anything else, also from two completely incompatible states. So the chances of anything of any particular importance emerging from these talks, I think, is very, very low. Washington desperately needs to secure the issue of the Hormuz Straits. Washington's actions have led to the closure of the Straits. Let's be very, very clear. As your other guest, Dr. Altikrati, said earlier on, the Straits were not closed. The Straits have been closed due to the attacks on Iran. So in order to get trade moving again, in order to get the energy sector up and moving again, the Straits have to be opened. And that is something that the Americans are absolutely desperate to assure. But it's not as easy as it might seem at all. Now, obviously, Iran is asking for some they have some very, very strong demands that are going to be very, very difficult for the American side to digest, never mind actually agree to. So Iran is asking for complete US military withdrawal from the GCC countries, sanctions reliefs, full control over Hormuz, etc. There's very, very, very little overlap, so we're not really going anywhere. The basis of any negotiation is the fact that the two parts can formulate some form of compromise. That is the ABC. The other part of the ABC of negotiations is that you prepare for them and you send people who are credible. And here I would argue that once again, the team that has been sent, this time with the addition of Vance, the team is the same old team. And quite frankly, as we have seen, they are no match. They are no match whatsoever for their Iranian counterparts. We have a massive cultural clash here. Let's not forget that Iran is a country that has thousands of years of history. It's a very sophisticated country. We have our own views. We all have our own personal views on the theocracy. We may like it, we may dislike it. But the simple fact of the matter is that there is a level of sophistication that the American negotiators completely lack. So we have complete and utter distrust. Let's not forget that negotiations that were interrupted, that were actually going quite well, were interrupted because Iran was attacked. What form of credibility that gives the Americans, I have absolutely no idea whatsoever. So just to conclude, basically, what we have today is something of a pressured arrangement where the main actors are in the same building, not necessarily in the same room. I have as yet to see any proof of their actually being in the same room. So this is not about diplomacy resolving a conflict at all. This is a case of testing the waters, trying to understand if there is a basis for future negotiations, and it's going to take quite a long time before anything concrete emerges from this at all. So in terms of risk, it's a pause in a completely unresolved conflict that is unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. So basically, all we can hope for is that these talks set preconditions for negotiations and don't result in a return to the danger of further escalation.
Thank you, Mr. Marklow. And now let's get the reaction of Dr. Raja. Dr. Raja, as a British Pakistani analyst, I want to focus on the mediator in the room here. So Islamabad has become the peace capital, hosting rare direct negotiations for the first time in decades. However, we're seeing a distinct pattern where US and Zionist actions, the Natanz strike on March 21st, for example, the ongoing bombing of Beirut, all seem calibrated to undermine the very diplomacy Pakistan is facilitating. Now, is Pakistan being set up to fail as the face of a peace process while the military-industrial complex continues the war? Or maybe does Islamabad have genuine leverage in this geopolitical game?
Thank you very much. This is a very significant question. I must say that it's difficult to predict anything at this moment. However, I would like to start off with the part B. Pakistan does have a lead in a sense because Pakistanis are backed by their friends and like the close friends, allies, Chinese, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. because they all have stakes in the region. So in that sense, yes, Pakistan is being backed by his friends, and that is why you see the Pakistanis look so confident in this talk. However, the first part of your question is concerned that Pakistan is being set to fail. I must say that especially when you watch the Indian media and the Israeli media, given the track record of Israelis during the peace talks, it's not new to their record of assassination, false flag operation in the past during the peace talks and killing particularly the key figures involved in the talks. So in that sense, there's a lot of talk going on in America, in India, especially on the Indian media. We know that there's this Israeli lobby which is very active in America, and as you can see that the prominent figures in America, for example, General Mike Flynn, he came up, he tweeted that he accused Pakistan that the Pakistanis are supplying Iran the Chinese missiles through Pakistan. So these are kinds of things. On one hand, these talks are going on, and Pakistan is playing a crucial role for which Pakistan does deserve a credit and recognition on international level, because as you see, initially it was very difficult to bring these two rivals during the peak of war together on one table. And I think the first hurdle is being successfully cleared as the Pakistanis has been successful bringing in both parties together. And I'm sure that at some point these talks may extend, or may the ceasefire may be possibly be extended, as we have reports. And so there is a lot of opposition. Before the start of the war, the President Modi, he visited Israel, and the next day he had internal attacks, over 50 attacks in the Balochistan and like KPK. So there's an alliance between India and Israel, and on this part, because India as a rival to Pakistan, and India is not at all in a position to accept Pakistan's role as a peacemaker, because as you see that because of in the past, particularly in link with India and Israel, Pakistan is being portrayed in American media as well like violence, terror state, failed state. So with these talks, Pakistanis have won the title. Its status has raised. Its status has raised. It's now a country which is no more aligned or associated with terror, violence, and FTFA, but rather a peacemaker. So in brief, there are there are reports. On the Indians and the Israeli lobby is working jointly, working hard to make sure that the Pakistanis these talks fail. So we have a mixed message here. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. And now let me bring in from the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Professor or Dr. Hussein Fatni. He's a professor of law and society. Professor Fatni, thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the invitation, and my regards to your guest and to your audience as well. Thank you.
Our pleasure. So, Professor, my question from a legal standpoint, when a ceasefire is declared but immediately violated, as we are seeing with continued strikes in Lebanon, does it retain any binding legal status, or does this undermine the very concept of negotiated truces under international law?
Look, this is a part of international law that is unfortunately very weak and often has been really violated by the actors in the international system. But that should not really give us really a very bad image about international law, because our life definitely our lives will be really miserable without international law, because on a daily basis, we as individuals benefit a lot from international law. And I'm not trying really to dwell on this, but I just want to remind your audience and remind your guests there are so many fields of international law that work effectively. The fact that, to just give an example or two, the fact that we can fly, take a plane and go into another country and cross the airspace of another nation, whether you're going on a vacation or not, the fact that we can do that and enter an airspace of a nation, that's because of international law. The fact that we can go and buy some goods that we import from another country, that is international because of its international agreement, international treaties, because international law is really equal to international agreement, international treaties, whether it's international public law, international private law. Unfortunately, one branch of international law that does not really work, it's this humanitarian law and international criminal law. And as we know, international criminal law, if we really even look at its counterpart at the domestic level, it does not really work. I mean, in any country, just go and say, hey, criminal law work. It does not work at the domestic level. So we're not really going to expect it to work at the international level. Now, with all that said, the United Nations is a reflection of the members of its members. And countries like the United States, they are given the veto power for various reasons. One of the reasons is they are supposed to make sure that the rule of law is really enforced. Now, you can expect that other nations, whether it's Iran or whether it's the Gulf countries, or even if you put the state of Israel on that level, the problem is when you have a country like the United States violating the rule of law, and does not really pay attention to the enforcement of the rules of law, especially humanitarian law, then that is really a problem. And that's why it is very problematic, because international law is about perception, is about images. When you have the image of the United States, a superpower, that in a way differs from the image that we should have about the former Soviet Union, about Russia now, about China, which the US is supposed to be the defender of the rule of law. When a country like the United States violates the rule of law, then that is really very, very problematic, because the United States is really setting a very, very bad precedent. What will the United States tell China if China invades Taiwan? What will the United States tell Russia, in addition to the Ukraine, that Putin would like to reconstruct the former Soviet Union by invading other countries like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and all that? You see, this is really the problem of the United States, is really creating a very, very bad precedent. And if there is anyone who should really pay attention and protect the enforcement of the rule of law, is the United States. It's in that context that legal scholars and the American public opinion is very abhorred at the violation of the international law by the American administration.
Mm-hmm. But then, in light of what you just mentioned, Professor, is there any legal credibility left whatsoever in the UN Charter and the Geneva Conventions, or have we fully transitioned to what Ocampo calls a world run by the will of individuals rather than rules?
Well, look, there is that perception, okay? There is that perception, but unfortunately, as I stated, there are violations in this area, but at one time or another, when the dust settles down, these nations that violate international law, they will be held to an account, okay? There is the International Court of Justice, there is the ICC, all those nations, they will pay in one way or another. The United States is already paying, okay? There is no question that the US has already or is already paying, because as I stated, the fact that the United States is creating a very bad image, very bad precedent. What will the United States tell China tomorrow that if China invades Taiwan? What will the United States tell Russia if Putin now engages and occupy other or behave in an aggressive way besides the Ukraine on other former Russian states, like, as I said, Tajikistan? So there is really a problem here. The US will pay a very, very big price for that. So I would not really say that we really have that the international system is really a system where we have really an anarchical situation. It's not really the rule of the jungle there. I think these nations, no matter what, whether they're small or big, it's gonna be a payday, because now we have these images and perceptions. Because remember that nations are like individuals. We individuals, the way we treated is the way we behave, the way we perceive. We have images, we have personalities, we have an inside and outside personality, and people are going to judge us. And these actors, whether they're small or big in terms of power, they are judged already. International relations and international is about images and perceptions. And they know that. You're not going to find any nations today that violates international law and says, yes, I violated international law. What are you really going to do about it? As a matter of fact, they always try to justify what they have done is not a violation of international law. So all I'm trying to say, there is no nation that violates international law and gets away with it. It will come a day where they have to be held in judgment.
In light of that insight, Professor Fatni, let me bring Dr. Takriti again. Dr. Takriti, Iran has submitted 16 formal letters to the ICC and other global bodies documenting massive civilian infrastructure damage from unprovoked war of aggression. Meanwhile, we have reports of US B-2 bombers striking nuclear facilities, creating nuclear dust, as President Trump once boasted. So is the silence from the European capitals and Western media on these ICC referrals and the attacks on Natanz a sign of international complicity, or does it reflect perhaps a general geopolitical paralysis? And at what point does the world's refusal to hold Israel and the United States accountable permanently fracture the global South's trust in Western-led institutions?
I'd like to go back just a little bit to the response of Dr. Hussein, whom I absolutely 100% defer to in terms of knowledge and expertise in international law. And I think that what he presented is nothing short of a masterclass in terms of the importance of international law and the repercussions of breaking international law and the such. However, if I may, I think that we are beyond perception. I think that we have entered into quite dangerous territory when it comes to not only the infringement of international law. I feel that the infringement and the violation of international law has already taken place, and to a degree has become one of the normal aspects of our daily political lives. I think that what is happening today is far more serious, and that is the infringement or the corrosion of international law and the international institutions as we have known them since the Second World War. I'll give you one example. Only a few days ago, we commemorated the 23rd anniversary of the invasion and fall of Baghdad, the American-British invasion of Baghdad and the occupation of Iraq, which until now reaps nothing but immense misery upon Iraqi people. Now, at the time, if we recall, that there were two major countries in the world, in fact three, that stood vehemently against the decision to go to war. France and Germany particularly, add to them Russia. And the argument was that there wasn't a proper investigation in the UN. There wasn't a proper citation or seeking or pursuance of a UN resolution in order to legitimize or validate the decision to go to war. With this war, one of the most brutal that we have seen in recent times, the United Nations wasn't even mentioned. No one even brought up the name of the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Mark Lowe, I would like...
Yes, my apologies. I was cut off.
Yes.
No one even brought the name of the United Nations. So we're seeing something far more serious than the mere perception that international law is being violated. We are seeing actual erosion of international institutions. Take, for instance, I mean, the United Nations is a very clear example, but NATO is also part of the international community. It's also part of the international order already, and for a while now. Trump has been talking about, well, NATO nations don't come to our defense when we call upon them. We pay far more than the others, as though this is some sort of poker table deal where everyone has to pay in order for everyone to protect everyone else, and particularly the mighty amongst them. The fact of the matter is that we are amid an ever-changing world, and a world that might not actually return to its former stage before now. I would even go even further and say that for the past 2.5 years, we have seen a constant, consistent, and systematic, deliberate violation of international law through the genocide that was committed in Gaza. And for over a year now, the ICC has issued a warrant in order to arrest Netanyahu. What's happened? He's going around the world, he's jet-setting, making decisions, and committing even further international crimes. Now, Dr. Hussein says the day will come. Okay, fine, I'm with you theoretically, but to what cause? People are being killed today by the very same man whom the ICC has issued a warrant for. There is no respect for this warrant. There is no one in their right mind who can imagine that if Netanyahu was to step off a plane in London, that he would be arrested. No one is even imagining that that is even a possibility. So what's the use of international law? Now, going back to your question, Karim, once again, we have an immense problem in regards with the whole prospect of exactly what is happening and why. Let's not forget that when we started this, the aim was, as we were told, to destroy the capacity of Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. And then all of a sudden now we're talking about totally different strategic objectives. The crimes that were committed are crimes that will continue to be committed. I mean, with all due respect to every single one of the international institutions, which I totally agree with Dr. Hussein, are an essential part of our everyday lives that we can live normally. But
how can we, if we come to name it by terms, Dr. Takriti, are we talking about geopolitical analysis or perhaps international complicity to do this and refusing to hold the others accountable?
I personally think, and listen, it could be that once this is over, we go back to the good old days when international law is respected, when international institutions have their say and have their stand. I personally don't think so. I think we're beyond the point of no return. I think that now, and for a while now, and especially with the heralding of Donald Trump as president of the US for the second time, I feel that international law is now a bit of a nuisance to those who have the power. I fear that we have entered a very dangerous realm, and that realm is that might is right, and whoever bears the biggest gun has the right to do whatever they wish. I hope I'm wrong, but I see all evidence proving that particular point. I don't think it's a matter of geopolitics in the determined design sense. I think this is mainly about personalities. It's about particular individuals, and it's about interests that, to be perfectly honest, are dictated by Israel. This is not an American war. No American can actually argue for more than one or two sentences about what kind of benefit this war that America is plowing tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in, is actually bringing to the average American. Clear. Not a single line can be argued. But the fact is that this war is happening, but it's happening at the behest of Israel. Israel is the only winner. In regards with Europe, Europe stands to lose big. It's losing its allies. It's losing, every single day we find rising prices for energy and fuel and the like, and people will be hit hard. And this is in the mid of a cost of living crisis. People will be feeling this in their pockets. And yet Europe has nothing to say. It didn't contribute in this war. It wasn't part of the planning committee. And it's not even going to be part of those talks in Islamabad. It's totally alienated. And Europe stands to lose big simply because now America will decide to leave Europe, standing to confront Putin's Russia alone. And all of a sudden, international treaties mean nothing. International standpoints mean nothing. International law and institutions mean absolutely nothing. Who is now bringing Trump to account and calling upon him for his call to commit war crimes openly, flagrantly, through his tweets?
Very clear points, Dr. Takriti.
Demanding that Trump be held accountable for what he's calling for a massacre and the destruction of a civilization. I think we are in very, very grave areas right now.
Thank you, Dr. Takriti. Very clear points indeed. And now I would like to have another perspective. Mr. Marclot perhaps can bring us a corporate risk perspective when it comes to international law. So, Mr. Marclot, when we come to look at the international law, do you think it is effectively suspended for certain actors, allowing them perhaps to target energy infrastructure and sovereign nuclear facilities without consequence? How do you advise multinational corporations and insurers to navigate the Persian Gulf? And if the rules-based order is a facade, how does one end the ride a tanker passing through Hormuz? And does this not signal perhaps the end of globalization as we have known it since 1945?
Again, a very complicated question. It's a series of smaller, all of which I'll answer. Let me just say one thing very, very quickly, please. And I think here we have to be very, very pragmatic. I'm not, well, in reality, I am an academic because I teach at a very prestigious Italian university, and I also teach at a very prestigious Italian business school. So I am an academic, but at the same time, I'm not an academic. I'm very, very pragmatic. I'm more of a frontline, coal-face individual. So as a frontline, coal-face individual, while I have to say that the comments made by Professor Fetney are absolutely spot on. His words are very, very important. They're quite moving. And it's very, very important that international rule of law and the rules-based order, which took us decades and decades to construct, are actually respected. We have the International Criminal Court, which has to be respected. But guess what? Whoever fell foul of the International Criminal Court, perhaps a few gentlemen from Western Africa and a few gentlemen from the Balkans. Otherwise, stop. So what I want to say is basically the following. While I completely 100% sign up to all of the concepts that the Professor Fetney pointed out, he's absolutely 100% correct. But unfortunately, as a very pragmatic individual, I have to say that the rules-based order is finished. It's over. There's no going back to it. We have to be pragmatic. It's game over. The future is going to be a very, very different place. We have had so many examples of countries, leaders, and individuals quite simply ignoring laws, simply ignoring established protocols. There is no going back. Now, that said, let's look at it from a corporate risk management perspective. I mean, basically, when there is no longer any respect for law, when the laws are no longer there to constrain the behavior of individuals, states, political parties, unions, etc., you no longer have a planning tool. If you're a company, you don't have a planning tool where said planning tool is international law. So you've got to shift immediately to start reasoning in terms of capabilities and intent. What might this country wish to do? What might the countries in this region like to do? What might the Gulf Cooperation Council or the European Union or what might a bloc of countries wish to actually do? We have to start thinking in these terms because there are no more guarantees. So it's a fundamental shift in corporate mindset. Let's take the most obvious example, the Hornwoods example, which by law, going back to the concept of law, must absolutely and categorically remain open. That is the famous international waters. There is a right of passage. There is a corridor that doesn't belong to anybody. So it has, by law, to remain open. But, law is one thing, reality is completely another. So, I mean, it's no longer an internationally recognized commercial corridor. Right just now, it's a very, very highly contested operating environment, one in which, and in the region at this point in general, ships, ports, and infrastructure and threats to them are leverage. Iran has this massive leverage. Mm-hmm. But let's not talk only about Iran. Let's imagine other choke points. Let's imagine other forms, not only of geographical choke points, but also political and access to raw materials, etc. Lots of different forms of choke points that are not always geographical or geological gifts. They're all leverage to lots of different companies. Getting very, very quickly, I'll try and recover some lost time. Very, very quickly, I'll close here. The insurance market. War risk premiums have gone up to the stars. Premiums have surged dramatically. Reinsurance is tightening. There are a number of governments that are considering sovereign guarantees because basically the private cover is under so much strain that the ship owners and operators simply cannot get insurance. So underwriting changes absolutely fundamentally. Exposure is reduced, the premiums rise. Intelligence becomes absolutely central in the sense that policies that are valid in the morning may longer be valid in the afternoon. It just depends what actually happens. It's a very dynamic place. The world has become very, very dynamic where change can happen very, very quickly. You have some... So we have a lot of potential disruptors to our operations. I mean, try operating in that environment. For the shipping world, it's an absolute disaster. So just to close, no, it's certainly not the end of globalization. But it's just a case of having to recognize that, the illusion of globalization, running on neutral rules or well-established rules is no longer. So what basically, is substituting what we have had until very recently is a system where political and geopolitical risk is the constant. It's visible and it's going to have to be priced into every single corporate decision.
Clear. Thank you, Mr. Maklo. As we have very little time left, I'd like to bring in Dr. Raja from a political and media perspective. Dr. Raja, briefly, please. We are seeing starkly different narratives between Western and non-Western coverage of this war. So has the information space itself become part of the conflict? And how does that shape global legitimacy, according to you?
I must say that, there is always a clash of interests. Even though there is a lot of talk these days for the past decade now, the dying of American empire and hegemony, but still, somehow Europe needs America both. It is just the Donald Trump's vision, America first, and moving to Venezuela, capturing Venezuela illegally for oil. So it seems that this war in the Middle East as well, slowly the Americans have realized that they are, winding up from different places. It happened in the past as well. Once the Afghanistan was priority in context of war, but then they left immediately, and So it always if you look into the history of Europe and America, it's like a war to a war to win another war, and particularly its strategy, a successful strategy to reshape public opinion and to divert public attention from local issues. So it's difficult to say because friends can be pro and pro can be friends. It always happens, and it's basically if you look into the post-Brexit in England, the public was very much confident that if UK is some of the politicians, nationalists, far rights like Nigel Farage were asking, arguing that if Britain leaves Europe, it will be successful, and now they're about nearly over 50%, like up to 58%. British public want to rejoin Europe. So these developments, given these developments, you can argue that it is really hard to predict that Europe is really moving away from America. Maybe because of the Trump's trade war, tariffs on European nations, Trump's very vocal stance on taking over Greenland, and all that has sent waves of discontent and had Trump has sat in its close allies. So that is one of the reasons the European nations are slightly, this war, particularly in this war on Iran, is not siding with the Americans. But based on this war, it's difficult to say that whether how long it continues or whether it's the genuine, and we can't measure the seriousness of European government in their stance to move away from America because the war in Ukraine, there is Russia, there's a lots of factors involved. So I must say that it could be a strategic deception, and when particularly they involve NATO. And a few days back, the resignation of Joe Kent, and later his predictions and his about NATO. It could be a war, a next plan, breaking of NATO, and then once the Turkey is no longer a member, then under the pretext of Greater Israel Project, there's another academic talks going on, like the next target is Turkey. So if Turkey remains a NATO member, under Article 5, the NATO nations are, supposed to, retaliate on and help any country, being attacked. So in that pretext, there's so many things going on altogether.
It is
really difficult to predict that Europeans are seriously thinking of, breaking their alliance with America. In the near future, I don't see it happening. It may have take some time, but you never know, because it's all game of interest. Once the European interests are aligned with America, they will be on board. And as you see, recently, from the Strait of Hormuz, Iranians have allowed a France associated ship to pass freely, which is like, there's different, both sides are making new alliances. So to say that the European nations are, how serious they are, it is difficult to exactly predict how serious they're seen as.
But perhaps what it could make
there is a lot of pressure on European governments. Public is rising up because of the war, because of the growing cost of rising prices, inflation, all that.
Thank you. Thank you for referring to that point, Dr. Raja. I have to include
not to that level.
Yes, Dr. Raja, sorry to cut your train of thoughts, because we have very little time left, and I'd like to bring in again Professor Fatni. Since you mentioned, Dr. Raja, the economic factor and how people are feeling the inflation, and how could that be some kind of a factor of pressure on the Western governments. Professor Fatni, the IMF's managing director has actually warned that even in a best case scenario, the war has dealt a big blow that will lead to slower growth, higher inflation and higher interest rates. So we are seeing energy emergencies and fuel rationing declared across Asia and Africa. given that the US and the Zionist entity knowingly attacked a country that controls one of the world's most vital energy choke points. So can this decision and the subsequent economic devastation to developing nations be framed as an act of economic warfare with legal consequences? And if a country's actions knowingly trigger a global recession, where is the legal liability here?
Well, unfortunately, the reality is when you have wars, you always end up with consequences. The legal liability will still reside in the way US will be perceived by the global society as a country that's supposed to promote and protect the rule of law, to a country that became a violator of the law. Images and perception are essential in international relations. The fact that the United States is supposed to be a country that supposed to promote respect for the rule of law, respect and obedience of the rule of law, or country that become basically a violator of the rule of law. So I'm sure at a later time, those violators of humanitarian law, which is basically talking here about the various conventions that address the laws of war, will be addressed. And countries like the United States are not really going to get away with it. So in that sense, unfortunately, the reality that the United States at this stage is paying a very significant price in terms of the international opinion of the global society. And as a superpower, and not really like any superpower, whether it's Chinese or we talk about the Russian, the United States is supposed to be totally different because it's a country that besides the economic power it has, besides the military power it has, it's supposed to be also about the rule of law. Because if you really take the rule of law out of the United States power, what is really left? You talk about economic power. Well, the Europeans have economic power. The Chinese have economic power. The Russians do in a sense. So what really makes the United States different and distinct from the other superpowers, in a way, is respect for the rule of law. And if the US end up basically violating the rule of law, then what's really left? And that's really what makes the American people very upset in a sense, is that, and when I say the American people, I really want to emphasize the fact that Americans at this stage have really no interest whatsoever in the US involvement in this war. If you look at the public opinion in the United States against the involvement of this war, and I know that one of my colleagues referred to the fact about Netanyahu doesn't really care, and he is engaged in using force and war. And well, I really want to answer my colleague by telling him the fact that he really doesn't have support of the American people in this war. As a matter of fact, AIPAC, which is the most powerful lobby in the United States here that supports Israel, is losing so much power that even the most supportive people of Israel, the Democratic Party, Republican Party, are running away from AIPAC, which is the most powerful lobby on behalf of Israel. They're running away from it. Suddenly, the Palestinian, Gaza, has so much support now. The Palestinians are suddenly becoming so supportive among the American people. Now they know more about the Palestinian. True. That the Palestinian cause is becoming so predominant within the American people. And that really tells you about the power of conviction and persuasions, and the way how people really see that what America is really doing was really wrong.
Thank you indeed, Professor Fatni, for all those insights. And this leads me to the next question. Since you talked about the public opinion, Dr. Takriti, very briefly, we have very, very little time left. And I would like to comment on this point when it comes to the most fascinating dynamic of this war, which may not be happening in Tehran nor Tel Aviv, but in Washington, where we have seen the resignation of senior counter-terrorism official Joe Kent, who stated Iran posed no imminent threat to the US and accused Netanyahu of dragging America into a war of choice. Also, we have Senator Bernie Sanders, who has vowed to block a $200 billion funding request for the war and arms to the Zionist entity, stating the U.S. started this war. Even within the MAGA base, there is a crack over the perception that American blood is being shed for Israel's war. So is the pro-Israel consensus that has dominated American foreign policy for decades finally irreparably shattering even among the elite?
I think that what Professor Hussein Fatni has just said is absolutely correct. I think that what is happening not only throughout America, but also within the American right, which in recent times has formed the very basis of Christian Zionism, which has been the biggest donor base for Israel and the biggest political support of Israel. The cracks within, as you describe, are cracks that are, in my view, irreparable. I think that the midterms coming up towards the end of the year are going to be quite expensive, and they are going to be incredibly indicative of what the American people think of the Trump presidency. Already, he's seen as the least popular American president in modern times. So, and that, to be perfectly honest, that brings us incredible hope. Because, I mean, regardless of all our misgivings in regards with the behavior of American administrations successive, whether Democratic or Republican, but it remains so that the conscience of America, as we are seeing today, remains alive. And the question that I think has emerged as a result of the genocide in Gaza, where people are saying, you know, why is it that we are involved in this? And it's whose behest? And for whose benefit? I think that that is a question that we were all around the world hoping that the American people would ask themselves a very, very long time ago. But now we are here. I hope, and I hope beyond hope, I hope that we will return to some semblance of sanity, particularly when it comes to international institutions. I hope that this marks a transformative moment in the conscience of humanity around the world, where we can't behave as we have been behaving in the past 20, 30 years, where major powers can behave with impunity. I hope we can restore a semblance of order to our world affairs. And I hope that when we come and discuss on your program again, Karim, that we'll be able to talk about some good things and a prosperous future, inshallah.
Inshallah, hopefully. Thank you so much, Dr. Takriti, for all these insights. And I thank all my panels, everybody by their name. Special thanks to Professor Hussein Fatni, Dr. Anas Takriti, Dr. Irfan Raja, and Mr. Mark William Lowe for all the sharp and insightful analysis. So tonight's picture is clear, a ceasefire that exists more on paper than in reality, a war that has shaken the very foundations of international law, and a transatlantic alliance is now openly divided. Economically, the warning signs are flashing: rising inflation, disrupted supply chains and an oil market under real strain. Politically, perhaps the cracks inside the American establishment are no longer hidden, they are widening. As talks continue in Islamabad, the question remains, can diplomacy de-escalate this crisis, or are we witnessing the unraveling of a unipolar world order? That's all for this special edition of All 24 News. From all of us here, good night and stay with us for continuing coverages. But until next time, do take care.